Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with a video lecture on the topic of the American Revolution. So we've been discussing in class how tensions were rising between the 13 English mainland American colonies and the mother country England over the issue of taxes. Basically, the colonists not believing that the English government, Parliament, and the King had the right to tax them. They wanted to be taxed by their own elected representatives in their own colonial legislatures. And so they had that motto, no taxation without representation. And ultimately, it was that concern over taxes that led to the great turning point in world history that we call the American Revolution, the world's most successful tax revolt. Now, one of the most important events leading up to the American Revolution had to do with the fact that even though when the colonists boycotted English goods during the 1760s, Parliament had backed off from many of the taxes it had tried to impose. It had repealed the Stamp Act and most of the Townshend Act taxes, but the Parliament had decided to leave a 3-penny tax on every pound of tea, and that was basically just to show that they could. They wanted to insist on that principle that they still had the right to tax the colonies, so they left that tax on tea. And so the colonists obviously didn't like that. So one night in 1773, there was a ship in Boston Harbor that was filled with English tea that was subject to that 3-penny tax. And so the group known as the Sons of Liberty, the ringleaders of the resistance, if you will, decided to dress themselves up as Mohawk Indians, board the ship with tomahawks and hatchets, and they broke open those chests of tea on the ship and they threw them all into Boston Harbor. And we call this event the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Now, obviously, the British government didn't like that one bit, and in fact, they determined to punish Boston and the colony of Massachusetts for this action until the Bostonians paid for that tea which had been destroyed. And so Parliament passed a series of what were known as the Coercive Acts. Basically, the Coercive Acts had a devastating effect on life in Massachusetts. They shut down the Massachusetts government. The Massachusetts legislature could no longer continue meeting. All the town meetings had to stop. Massachusetts was placed under martial law. That meant the British soldiers were in control of the colony. And the port of Boston was closed to all commerce, to all ships going in and out. And since the Bostonians were a seafaring people, that had a devastating impact on their economy. So the Coercive Acts definitely did not help to improve the relationship between the colony of Massachusetts and the mother country, England. But actual fighting did not break out until the night of April 18th going into April 19th, 1775, when the first battle of the American Revolution was fought. We call this the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Here's how it came about. The British commander in Boston, General Gage, had learned that the Patriot leaders had stores of weapons, guns, and ammunition hidden in the towns of Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. And also, it was known that certain leaders of the Sons of Liberty, like Sam Adams and John Hancock, were hiding out, and they were believed to be hiding out in those towns. And so, on the night of April 18th, 1775, General Gage decided to send out some of his troops to march to Lexington and then to Concord to try to capture those weapons and to capture those Patriot leaders. Now, the Sons of Liberty were ready for this. They expected that this would happen at some point. And so they had a system set up to warn the countryside of how any British troop movements were going to come about. And here I have to show you on a map. We'll come back to this slide, but if you take a look at this map, you see that the town of Boston actually was on that peninsula that you see there in the center of the map with the houses and buildings in red. A peninsula sticking out into Boston Harbor, and on the other side you have this river called the Charles River. And so the question was, if the British soldiers marched out, would they march down that neck of land and go by land, or would they get on boats and sail across the Charles River towards wherever they were going? And so the Sons of Liberty had worked out a symbol. If the British soldiers marched by land, they were going to put one lantern up in the steeple of the Old North Church in Boston so that everyone could see it. And if they went by water, by sea, they were going to put two lanterns up there. And that would trigger messengers to go out and to ride out on their horses into the countryside and warn the people of what was going down. So on this particular occasion, General Gage decided to send his troops by water and put them on boats and have them sail across the Charles River. And so the signal went up, the two lanterns in the belfry of the Old North Church. And immediately, the Patriot messenger sprang into action. Now, usually it's Paul Revere, the silversmith and Freemason, who gets the credit for this ride, Paul Revere's ride. It was immortalized in a famous poem by Longfellow. But actually, there were several riders who went out on that night, including Revere, into the countryside to warn the people that the British were coming. And so they took off to warn the people. Meanwhile, the British soldiers reached the village of Lexington. And the colonial militia, each town had its own little military group. And these groups were known as the Minutemen because they were ready to respond to any threat at a minute's notice. And so when the British soldiers got to Lexington Green, the Minutemen were waiting for them. The captain of the Minutemen in Lexington was named Captain Parker. He told his soldiers, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. And that's exactly what happened, because someone there on Lexington Green fired the first shot. We don't know whether it was a British soldier or an American Minuteman, but whoever it was, we call that the shot heard round the world, because it started the revolution that would have so many effects in the history of the entire world. And so there on Lexington Green, 8 of the Minutemen were killed. 1 British soldier was wounded. This was the first battle, the first blood of the American Revolution. But the British troops didn't find what they were looking for in Lexington, and so they headed on to Concord in the wee hours of April 19, 1775. And another battle was fought at Concord. This time, several people were killed on both sides. But once again, the British mission really had been a failure. They didn't find the weapons or the leaders in Concord either, and so now they had to turn around and head back to Boston. And this turned out to be a major problem for them, because by this time, Minutemen from all over the countryside, having been warned by Revere and his fellow messengers, had turned out and they were lining the road behind trees and bushes and rocks. And as the British soldiers passed by in their bright red coats, the Patriot militia began shooting at them, picking them off, and several dozen British soldiers were killed or wounded in their retreat back to Boston. Perhaps a sign that this war was not going to be as easy for the British as they had thought. The British had the best military in the world at this point in time. And they thought at the beginning of this war that it would just be a piece of cake to defeat this ragtag American militia. But the retreat to Boston perhaps was a sign it would not be quite so easy. The next major event in the American Revolution was the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga. Now, you have to understand that after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, large numbers of pro-American men had converged on the city of Boston. They had formed essentially a circle around Boston, made camps, and were conducting a siege to try to starve the British out of Boston. And a couple of those American leaders decided to do something bold. These were Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. They had heard that at the British fort of Ticonderoga in upstate New York, there was a very small garrison, just a very few British soldiers who were left there to hold the fort. And they figured it would be pretty easy to capture Fort Ticonderoga. And so they decided to do it. Both of these are very interesting characters in the Revolution. Ethan Allen was from Vermont. Actually, he was the leader of a paramilitary group called the Green Mountain Boys of Vermont, which had been fighting for a while for their independence from both New Hampshire and from New York State, both of which claimed Vermont. And so these guys were tough. They were fighters. Benedict Arnold was later, of course, to become known as the Great Traitor of the American Revolution. But at this point in time, he was a very young, promising, very brave, and well-respected patriot leader. And so Allen and Arnold got some troops together, and they set out for Fort Ticonderoga. And when they got there, Ethan Allen banged down the door of the fort, and he said, "Open up! In the name of the great Jehovah," that is God, and the Continental Congress. And the British commander, knowing he was outnumbered, did open the door and surrendered the fort to Allen and Arnold, and the fort was captured. Now, the main result of this for the American side was that there were about 120 pieces of artillery, that is cannon, large guns, in the fort, which Allen and Arnold captured. And they took steps to get that artillery shipped to Boston, where later it would play a role in the siege, as we will see. All right, the next major battle of the Revolution took place on June 16, 1775, and this has gone down in history as the Battle of Bunker Hill, but actually that was kind of fake news. The newspaper reports at the time said the battle took place on Bunker Hill, but that was a mistake. It actually took place on the next hill over in Boston, which was called Breed's Hill, but the name had kind of stuck, and so we still call it the Battle of Bunker Hill. What had happened was that overnight on June 15th, the Americans had put some troops up on that hill, and the British didn't like that, and General Gage decided he couldn't let those Americans hold that hill. And so he determined to send some of his troops up the hill the next day to dislodge the Americans. And they did. But it was a very difficult kind of victory. Because, you know, if you know anything about military strategy at all, you know that in war, it's always preferable to be on the high ground, okay? First of all, you can fire down on any advancing troops with a clear line of fire normally. Secondly, you have the attacking army. If you're attacking uphill, it's obviously more difficult, and you have to imagine the soldiers on a very hot summer's day. The British soldiers with their heavy coats and carrying large backpacks, which could weigh up to 50 or 60 pounds, full of equipment. Trying to slog up this hill. It wasn't easy, and really they were sitting ducks for American fire. Now, like I said, the British did win the battle. One of the results of the battle was that they cut off the head of one of the American generals, Dr. Joseph Warren of Boston, and that turned out to be a PR disaster for the British. But even worse for the British was the casualty count. Even though the British won the battle, they had 800 soldiers wounded and 226 killed, a casualty rate of about 50%. This was an astronomically high rate of dead and wounded in any battle. And so even though the British won the battle, you could say that really they couldn't afford too many more victories like this. Well, right at that same time, the Americans who were laying siege to Boston got a real shot in the arm when the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, decided to appoint a new commander for what they started calling the Continental Army. And they hit on George Washington of Virginia, of course, as the chief general of the army. Now, Washington was a natural choice, really. He was one of the few Americans who had any military experience. We've already seen how it was really Washington who started the French and Indian War back in 1754 with his attack on the French at Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania. In addition, Washington was a very impressive individual. He was considered very tall for his time. He was about 6'1". At that time, men were shorter, and so he was considered to be a very tall, very impressive physical specimen. He was incredibly brave, a great horseman, impeccable manners, a real gentleman, and just a very popular choice for the commander of the Continental Army. But when Washington arrived in Boston, he was shocked to learn that the Americans camped around Boston had almost no gunpowder. And actually, General Gage had heard that rumor that the Americans had no gunpowder, but he didn't believe it. He believed it was fake news that was being planted to deceive him into attacking. And actually, if Gage had attacked, he would have probably defeated the Americans. The war would have been over, since they had no gunpowder. But he chose not to do that. And so that gave Washington time to have some gunpowder manufactured. Meanwhile, on January 24, 1776, General Henry Knox showed up in Cambridge near Boston with all of those cannon from Fort Ticonderoga that had been captured the previous year. And that would turn out to really make the difference in the siege of Boston. On the night of March 7th, Washington ordered that the cannon be hoisted up onto the hills surrounding Boston. And so the next morning, when the new British commander in Boston, William Howe, woke up, he and his troops were dead in the line of fire of all those cannon pointing down at them. Howe knew that he was in trouble, so he sent a flag of truce out. And if you you've probably seen in movies, a flag of truce is a white flag. And the point of it is to say, look, don't shoot us, we just want to talk. And so Washington and Howe sent representatives, they talked, and the upshot of that was that on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, the British were allowed to leave Boston. And they left, of course, on their ships and went to Canada, British territory, to regroup. But I want to mention that with them, when the British troops left Boston, they took a fairly large number of Americans who were sympathetic to the British side in the war. And there were actually a large number of Americans who did not agree with the American Revolution, considered themselves to be loyal Englishmen, loyal subjects of King George III, and really didn't want any part in this war. And these people were called loyalists because they were loyal to the king. The slang term for them was Tories. That was kind of the insulting term that was used for them. Tories, T-O-R-I-E-S. And there were a lot of them. Historians estimate that up to a third of the American population during the Revolution were actually loyalists or Tories. And so one of the large groups of loyalists or Tories actually were a number of African Americans who came over to the British side. Why? Because the British leaders announced that if black slaves would run away and would join the British Army, or if free blacks would join the British Army, that they would, well, the slaves would be given their freedom, and all of these African Americans would be taken care of as British citizens. So actually, for many African Americans, the best option was to support the British side, and many of them actually did that. So among these loyalists who evacuated to Canada were some African Americans, and their descendants are living in Canada to this day. Well, anyway, this was a great victory, though, for Washington and the Continental Army. They had chased the British out of Boston and taken that city back. However, you better believe that the British were not going to take this lying down, and they were going to come back, and they were going to come back in force. And so they set their sights on New York City for their big counterattack. And in July 1776, one night, a large British fleet sailed into New York Harbor, a very large fleet of ships, containing 32,000 troops in total. This was actually the largest British invasion force in history that had ever been launched up to that point. And I want to mention that out of the 32,000 troops on the British side on those ships, not all of them were actually British. About 8,400 of them were Hessians, that is, they were Germans from the small German state of Hesse. King George III had approached the ruler of Hesse and had offered him money if he would allow some of his troops to come and fight on the British side. And so the Hessians were what we call mercenaries. They were soldiers of fortune. They were fighting for pay. And because of that, the Americans hated the Hessians even more than they hated the British soldiers. To them, it was one of the lowest things you could do, to take money to fight to take away other people's liberties as they saw it. And so the Hessians became, in their green jackets, you see there in the illustration, were among the most hated of the troops on the British side. To counter this large invasion force, Washington had only 17,000 troops. So it was really a tall order, and furthermore, he had to scatter those troops out among what are now the 5 boroughs of New York City: Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, the Bronx, Staten Island, to try to defend all of those places. So that made it even more difficult that he had to divide his army. Well, the British did make their headquarters on Staten Island, which they captured pretty quickly. And from there, they prepared to invade Long Island. Now here I have to once again go to a map. Excuse me for a second. So if you look on this map over in the right central part of the screen, you see Long Island, which today is the home of Brooklyn and Queens. And then across the East River from Long Island, you see the long skinny island of Manhattan, where it says New York. So you see also how the British launched their invasion from Staten Island over into Long Island, and it was very successful from the very beginning. And so quickly they pushed Washington's troops back against the East River and surrounded them at the place which is still known as Brooklyn Heights. And that was really a terrible situation for Washington to be in. Essentially, he was surrounded by British troops by land, and by water, the British ships could sail up the East River and they could cut him off. And so it really looked like Washington was going to have to surrender a force of about 10,000 soldiers there at Brooklyn Heights, until on the evening of August 29th, a storm rolled over the New York area, followed by a very thick fog, thick as pea soup, which blanketed the entire region. And what that meant was that the British couldn't sail their ships up the East River through the fog. It was too dangerous. And so that gave Washington a brief window where he could evacuate his troops. And so, acting very quickly, he commandeered every boat in the entire area, and he began ordering that his troops be rowed across the East River to Manhattan one by one. And early that morning, George Washington, was the last to evacuate Brooklyn Heights. All the troops were saved. And in later years, when people looked back on the war, you know how in a war people always think God is on their side, right? Well, after the Americans won the war, of course they thought that as well. And this was one of the moments they pointed to in the Revolution where they really felt like God had intervened on the American side, that God had made that storm and that fog roll in just so that Washington could evacuate his troops there from Brooklyn Heights and save his army. Whatever you may think of that theory, most Americans firmly believed it, that this was an act of providence and that God had showed that he was in favor of the American cause there at Brooklyn Heights. But the battle for New York did not go well for Washington and the Continental Army, and quickly the British pushed the army all the way up to the north part of Manhattan Island, where on November 16th the British captured Fort Washington, capturing 3,000 American troops in the process. And at that point, Washington had to evacuate New York entirely and try to escape through New Jersey from the British onslaught. And so once again on the map, you see the blue line showing the American troops crossing the Hudson River into New Jersey and retreating southwestward towards Pennsylvania, and with the British General Lord Cornwallis in hot pursuit. That's the red line, the British troop advance pursuing Washington to the Delaware River. And so eventually Washington wound up crossing over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in order to regroup. Now, at this point, you can say that the Continental Army was in deep, deep trouble. After the defeat in New York, Washington had less than 6,000 men left in his army. Furthermore, it was getting close to the end of the year in December, and nearly all the troops in his army had signed up for a one-year enlistment to end on December 31st, New Year's Eve. And so at that point, Washington knew he was going to lose the majority of his army and essentially would have no choice but to surrender, unless he did something really dramatic, something that would bring up American morale in a big way. And so Washington decided to do just that. He knew that across the Delaware River at Trenton, New Jersey, there was a force of about 1,000 Hessians, and he also knew that on Christmas Eve, the Hessians would certainly be drinking a lot of beer and partying, and that the next morning they would be sleeping it off. And so he chose the morning of Christmas Day, 1776, to launch a surprise attack on the Hessians at Trenton. And so the attack was executed. Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River, which had large chunks of ice floating in it. There's that very famous painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware, which you can see in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda if you have been there or if you've ever get a chance to go there. The password for this mission was victory or death. Victory or death, because Washington knew that if they didn't win this battle, pretty much the game would be up, as he put it in a letter to a friend. So they had to win. This was their last shot. And they did win. As Washington predicted, the Hessians were all drunk and hungover, and very easily the Americans surrounded them in their camp and captured all 1,000 of them, with the loss of only 3 American deaths. So it was a smashing, surprising victory there at Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Day, 1776. And it really did turn out to be a very important shot in the arm for the American cause, this victory at Trenton. After Trenton, Washington continued to maneuver across New Jersey very successfully, with Cornwallis pursuing him. Um, he won another victory in the Battle of Princeton. Washington did on January the 2nd, and after that, through very, very clever tactics, Washington was able to keep Cornwallis from capturing his very small army. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, steps were being taken to recruit more soldiers and to try to improve the military picture for the Continental Army. And one of the leaders in that effort was a writer named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was actually from England, but he had come over to America and had embraced the American cause. And in 1777, Paine issued a series of pamphlets that were known as the American Crisis. The first crisis pamphlet begins with these words: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Now, what do you think Paine meant by the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot? Essentially, he's saying this is a very trying to difficult time. A summer soldier or a sunshine patriot might be the kind of soldier who would just show up when things were good, when the sun was shining and when it looked like the American side might win, but then, of course, just disappear when things got tough, kind of like a fair weather friend. Well, Paine is saying we don't need that kind of soldier. We don't need the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. What we need are men who are going to stick with this cause through thick and thin, no matter what, who are going to take the tough times and survive and endure and stick with the cause. And so these were powerful words that did motivate quite a few people to join the army. Perhaps even more important, the Continental Congress changed the terms of enlistment for Continental soldiers. Excuse me. They said that from now on, if you enlisted in the army, you had to enlist for 3 years or the duration of the war, whichever was longer. And so this guaranteed that Washington would have soldiers who would be with the army until the end of the war, till the bitter end. And so by May, there were between 8,000 and 9,000 new recruits to the Continental Army, and the army was saved. But again, a lot of that had to do with Washington's very clever victory at the Battle of Trenton, which really did help morale. Well, however, now that the British held New York City, they decided to try a new master plan that they thought would end the war very quickly. If you look at the map here, you see New York City with Long Island sticking out there and slightly below the center of the map. And the river that's going up almost due north from New York City is the Hudson River. And you see that it runs into a couple of lakes, Lake George and Lake Champlain. And that waterway goes up to the Canadian border. So since Canada was also held by the British decided to try a new strategy that would cut America in half at the Hudson River. And so the plan was that General William Howe was going to lead troops up the Hudson River, and meanwhile General Johnny Burgoyne was going to take his army down from Canada, down Lake Champlain and Lake George, and meet Howe somewhere around the city of Albany, New York. And so that was the plan, and Burgoyne launched his part of the plan and began heading southward. But unbeknownst to him, Howe chickened out. And he decided that it was too dangerous to take his troops up the Hudson River. He feared that Washington would launch a flank attack on his army, might be able to surround them and capture them. So it was his respect for Washington's tactical ability that led Howe to abort his part of the plan, unbeknownst to anybody. And he defied his orders, and instead of taking his troops up the Hudson River, he put them on ships and sailed them down into Chesapeake Bay, as you can see on the map there, and then all the way back around up to Philadelphia, where he attacked Philadelphia and captured that city successfully. But the problem was that Burgoyne was still advancing down, executing his part of the plan, not knowing that Howe had really left him high and dry without any support. Furthermore, Burgoyne made a mistake when he reached Fort Ticonderoga at the southern tip of Lake Champlain. He could have then got on ships and sailed down Lake George, but instead he decided to march his troops through the forest. Now, this part of upstate New York to the present day, I have been there, and it is still a wilderness. It is very wild. It's a very rural area. Very few good roads even today. And at that time, all that Burgoyne had to travel down were old Indian trails through the forest. And furthermore, Burgoyne, his nickname was Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne because he really liked the high life. You know, he liked to live it up, wine, women, and song. And actually, he was carrying with him large amounts of wine, great food, china, silver plates. He had several women traveling with the expedition, and they had their dresses and their clothes and so forth. And so Burgoyne had just a huge amount of baggage that was being brought along with the army in wagons, and that tended to slow the army down. Meanwhile, the American troops in the vicinity adopted what was called a scorched earth policy. And what that meant was essentially they burned everything in sight, including the crops belonging to American farmers, which was a real hardship. But the point of this was to make sure that the British could not capture those food crops and live off the land, if you will, trying to make things more difficult for the British troops as they advanced, and they did. And furthermore, the American troops were chopping down trees and laying the trees across Burgoyne's trail that he was following, and so the British army would have to stop and chop up those tree trunks and get them out of the way before they could advance any further down the road. And so pretty much by midsummer of 1777, Burgoyne and his army had come to an almost complete halt and were moving at a snail's pace through the wilderness of upstate New York. Well, the big question at this point, would the new commander in New York City, General Sir Henry Clinton, send any of his troops up the Hudson River to help Burgoyne? But while Clinton agonized over that decision, one of those events took place which sometimes happen in war that seem to be very trivial, but actually turn out to have major consequences. And this event had to do with a young woman named Jane McCrae, who was the daughter of an American farmer in the area. Now, it just so happened that Jane's boyfriend had joined the British Army as a loyalist, and he was actually with Burgoyne's army traveling southward. Jane McCrae heard of that. She sent him a message. They made a date to meet out in the forest. But while Jane McCrae was on the way to meet her fiance in the woods, she was set upon and attacked by a group of Indians who were allied with the British, and they attacked Jane McCrae, scalped her, and killed her, and left her there in the woods dead. Now, news of this event traveled like lightning through all of the American settlements in the entire area, and this was another PR disaster for the British, because all the Americans in the area became convinced that the British had ordered their Indian allies to attack women and children and to scalp them and to kill them. And so basically every able-bodied American male for miles around turned out to join the army, and the numbers of the American army just skyrocketed overnight thanks to the death of Jane McCrae. So with these new troops, the Americans were able to win the Battle of Bennington, Vermont on August the 16th, and by August 19th there were 13,000 American troops in the area. Burgoyne pitched camp at the town of Saratoga, New York on September 13th, and he took stock of his situation. He knew he was surrounded by a large American army, and he knew his options were dwindling. So on September 19th, he decided to try to break out of the encirclement, and he sent a party to see if they could find a way out. And this party met an American force at Freeman's Farm and took 600 casualties. So at that point, Burgoyne knew that unless Clinton showed up with a large army, he was going to have to surrender. And he held out as long as possible, but finally, facing dwindling supplies and a hopeless situation on October 17th at Saratoga, General John Burgoyne surrendered to the American commander Horatio Gates. This is known as the Battle of Saratoga, and it was a huge turning point in the American Revolution. About 6,000 British troops were taken out of combat with Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. But the ultimate result of it was even more significant than that, because our ambassador in Paris, France, was none other than Benjamin Franklin. And as soon as Franklin got the word of Burgoyne's surrender, he immediately went to the French king, Louis XVI, and he proposed a treaty of alliance between the United States and France. By the way, of course, America had declared independence already in the summer of 1776. July 2nd, 1776 was actually the day that Congress declared independence, not July 4th. July 4th was actually the day that Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence was adopted. But in any case, the new United States of America and the French nation signed the Solemn Treaty of Alliance on February 6, 1778, and France came into the war on the American side, and later Spain would as well. And this, I think, really was the key to the American victory in the war, because France supplied a large number of soldiers, a large amount of money, sailors, ships, supplies, weapons. They didn't do that solely out of the goodness of their hearts, because you may recall, of course, that the French had lost the French and Indian War to England. They had lost all their colonies in North America, and of course they wanted revenge, and they saw that this revolution gave them a chance to get back at the British. And so that was, I think, one of their main motives for entering the war. But in any case, I really don't believe that the United States would have won this war had it not been for the assistance of France and Spain. And we'll see how that assistance was offered as we go on. By the way, Washington had taken no part in the Battle of Saratoga. He was with his troops near Philadelphia, having lost that city to Howe. And as winter set in late 1777, Washington took his army into his winter camp at a place called Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. And in American history, Valley Forge became a symbol of suffering for a cause, because the winter at Valley Forge was a terrible experience for the army. Essentially, the army had almost no food, and many troops were literally starving to death. Even though in the area around Valley Forge there were a great many prosperous farmers who had large amounts of food stored up in their barns, those farmers refused to sell their crops to Washington or their farm animals to Washington. And Washington refused to just take that from the farmers. He didn't want to cause, bad feeling with the local farmers, so he didn't just commandeer them. Instead, he offered the farmers money which the Continental Congress was printing up on paper dollars, continentals, continental currency. And at this point in history, paper money was something new. All money pretty much was in the form of gold and silver coins. And so when Congress began printing up paper money, people really did not trust it. It was kind of like monopoly money. They didn't see that it had any value at all. And very quickly, this currency depreciated. That meant that it became almost worthless, and it would literally take thousands of dollars to buy a loaf of bread or something because of the inflation. This currency was worth so little. And the Pennsylvania farmers simply refused to accept it. And so the Army had very little food. It was a very bad winter. There was lots of snow. There was illness and disease in the camp. There was a shortage of clothing for the soldiers, winter clothing. And so there were many eyewitness accounts by people who visited Valley Forge talking about how the soldiers were walking around leaving bloody footprints in the snow because their feet, they had no shoes or boots, and their feet were cracked and bleeding, frostbitten, and that they were leading these bloody trails in the snow. And actually at Valley Forge, about 2,500 soldiers of the Continental Army died of hunger, starvation, exposure, disease, and so forth, not from battle. So it was a very difficult time in American history. But when a group of people go through a trauma or a crisis together, and when they survive, the effect of that is often to bring that group of people closer together and give them a new sense of purpose and belonging. And actually, we might remember that as I record this lecture right now. We're in the middle of the 2020 coronavirus outbreak. And so when we get through this, we might reflect on this colonial experience at Valley Forge, because coming out of this crisis, the Continental Army actually became stronger in a number of ways. They had a greater sense of morale, a greater sense of commitment to each other. It was like that band of brothers feeling. They had survived this terrible experience together with their commander in Washington, who had shared their suffering. And so they came out of Valley Forge newly unified. Also, at Valley Forge, Washington appointed a Prussian nobleman, that's the eastern part of Germany, Baron von Steuben, to drill the troops and teach them military drill. That's, kind of how you march, how you carry your weapon, and so forth. Military drill. Steuben was an experienced officer from the Prussian army, and he took on this task, and he composed a little manual of military drill called the Blue Book, which became the official American military manual for many years after that. And so with Steuben's help, the troops became more disciplined and better drilled, more like professional soldiers there at Valley Forge. I want to mention that Steuben was not the only European volunteer to play a very important part for the Continental Army during the American Revolution. There were actually several high-ranking European noblemen who came over and volunteered for the American cause simply because they agreed with it. And among those were the Frenchman Baron de Kalb and two Poles, Tadeusz Kosciuszko and Count Casimir Pulaski. But the most famous of all the European volunteers was Gilbert du Motier, the Marquis de Lafayette, a very high French nobleman, very wealthy young man, very idealistic, who believed in the American cause, and came over and volunteered, and eventually became one of Washington's aides de camp, one of his chief aides. And in fact, Washington and Lafayette became very close. Now Washington, he had married his wife Martha after she had had a previous marriage. Her husband had died, and Martha was a little older than George. She had children from her previous marriage, but Washington and Martha Washington never had any children of their own. And so, and Washington never had a son. And so in a way, the Marquis de Lafayette became like Washington's surrogate son, and they had a very close relationship for the rest of Washington's life. And you may have seen these names before because there are lots of towns and counties and rivers and public squares and things like that named after these men throughout America, especially Lafayette. You see that name a lot. So they definitely made a great contribution to the cause. Well, by this point in time, the British government and British public opinion were beginning to turn against the war. And the British had realized this was not going to be any kind of easy victory, especially after the Battle of Saratoga. And so the British began to get cold feet, and Parliament actually repealed all the laws, the tea tax, the coercive acts, and all the laws that the colonists had been mad about in 1778, and they decided to send ambassadors to America to talk with members of Congress to try to work out a peace deal. And to make this even sweeter for the colonists, the General Howe decided to leave Philadelphia completely, leave it to the Americans, and go back to New York City. But really, by this point in time, it was just too little, too late. You know, you might have expected the Americans to take this deal. After all, the British were offering them everything they had asked for. But first of all, the Americans had already declared independence, and they didn't want to go back from that. Second, just too much blood had been spilled. There was too much water under the bridge. Too much suffering had taken place. And so the Americans said thanks but no thanks to the British peace deal. We're going to continue fighting for our independence. And as Howe evacuated his troops from Philadelphia to New York, he went by land and marched across the state of New Jersey. Washington saw an opportunity to win a victory over the retreating British force. Washington actually very rarely attacked the British. He was a very cautious general, very clever general, but very cautious. He only fought if he knew that he had a good chance to win. And so this was one of those rare occasions when Washington actually attacked the British. At a place called Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, he attacked the British rear guard, and probably would have won this battle had it not been for the treachery of General Charles Lee, who years later was discovered to be a British spy. Lee refused to obey Washington's orders at a crucial point in the battle, and so the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse was sort of a bloody draw. Neither side really won. But there was one hero of the Battle of Monmouth who became very famous after the Revolution. This was a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes, better known as Molly Pitcher. So Mary Hayes' husband was an artillery officer. He was in charge of a cannon crew, and his wife would often bring pitchers of water out to the soldiers, to the crew. So she was known as Molly Pitcher. But during this battle, you know, it was all hands on deck, and so Molly Pitcher actually came out and started helping them load and fire the cannons. So she took part in the combat in that battle and became kind of a famous female warrior of the Revolution. But actually, historians know now that there were several women who served in the Continental Army during the Revolution by pretending to be men, by cutting their hair and putting on men's clothes. The most famous of them was Deborah Sampson. In 1782, Deborah Sampson joined the Continental Army, giving the name Robert Shirtleff. And so Robert fought in several battles and finally was wounded. And when Deborah Sampson was carried to the medical tent to be treated after she was wounded, you know, the doctors stripped her, and they said, Robert? Immediately realizing this was not a man. And so, as a result, Deborah Sampson was discharged from the Army, but she was given an honorable discharge, and furthermore, she was allowed to join the American Revolutionary Veterans groups, and she was actually accepted as a fellow soldier by her fellow veterans, as someone who had been wounded for the American cause. And she even got a pension from Congress and wrote an autobiography talking about her experiences. So she became kind of a famous hero of the Revolution. All right, well, I want to talk a little bit about the role that Indians, Native Americans, played in this war. So, you know that the Indians had always liked the French and they really didn't like the British, but by this point in time, they really hated the Americans. They knew that all the Americans really wanted was their land, and furthermore, the British had won the Indians over to some extent by the Proclamation of 1763, which had banned settlement beyond a line running through the Appalachian Mountains, forbade the Americans to take any Indian land across that line, and so that had made the Indians a little bit more friendly towards the British. So most of the Indians who fought in this war fought on the British side, especially the Iroquois. The Six Nations of the Iroquois now did fight on the British side, and in July 1778, Iroquois Indians joined forces with Tory regiments to attack American frontier settlements, beginning with the settlement of Wyoming Valley, Pennsylvania in July 1778. And then in November, they struck Cherry Valley, New York, and massacred and killed and scalped a large number of American settlers. And Washington was really furious about this. And so in July 1779, he sent Colonel Saint Leger with an American force into upstate New York to attack the Iroquois towns. And essentially, all the Iroquois villages were burned and destroyed. And this turned out to be really the end of the Iroquois as a great military power in North America, this 1779 expedition. Farther west, Indians were also fighting for the British against those few American settlers who had snuck across the Proclamation line and were settled in places like Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, and so forth. There was a British commander in Detroit. His name was Colonel Henry Hamilton, who became known as the hair buyer. Why? Because basically he would give cash money to any Indian who came in with an American scalp. So he was called the hair buyer. Now, in Virginia, there was a young soldier named George Rogers Clark who heard about the hair buyer and heard about the attacks on American frontier settlements, and he was very angry about that. So he went to the governor of Virginia and got permission to create an army, which he sailed down the Ohio River, got off in present-day Indiana, and proceeded to capture 3 British forts in Indiana and Illinois, the forts of Kaskaskia, Vincennes, and Cahokia. And Clark's expedition was a great success for the American side, and really it was one of the main factors that led to that region of the Ohio Valley and part of the Mississippi Valley being given to the United States in the treaty after the war ended. But if you want to find out how the war ended, the story is going to continue in the next lecture, and we're going to finish that up in the lecture on the Confederation, so you'll have to stay tuned for that.